The dusk came early to Ashbourne that October, the light draining from the sky before the servants had finished lighting the hall candles, and it was in that gray, uncertain hour that the Duke of Ashbourne first saw her slip through the garden gate. He had been standing at the tall window of his study, his coat still on, a letter from his solicitor unread in his hand, when the movement caught him. A woman in a gray wool dress, a maid's apron loose at her waist, moving with a purpose that struck him as wrong. Not hurried exactly, but deliberate in the way of someone who had calculated the distance between one lamp and the next. She carried something against her chest, tucked inside the fold of her arm, and she glanced once over her shoulder before she passed through the gate that opened onto the lane beyond the kitchen garden. He was outside before he had decided to go. He told himself it was prudence. The house had been unsettled since his mother arrived 2 weeks prior, with her house guests and her opinions and her candidate for the position of the Duchess of Ashbourne. Things had gone missing in other great houses during such visits. Small valuable things, a snuff box here, a miniature there, and he was a man who believed in addressing problems at their source. He told himself this as he moved along the stone path behind the yew hedge, his breath barely visible in the cooling air, his footfalls quiet on the damp grass. He told himself this was merely duty, and nothing more. He told himself he felt nothing particular about the girl in the gray dress. The lane beyond the gate was a narrow track that wound between the kitchen garden wall and the home wood, used by the dairymaids in the morning and by no one else at this hour. She walked quickly, head down, and he kept his distance, but did not lose sight of her. What she carried was small and square, pressed flat against her ribs. He thought it was a book. He thought it might be a miniature. He thought it could be the silver letter opener his mother had admired at breakfast 3 mornings ago. He did not call out. He would observe, he decided. He would see where she went and what she did, and then he would have the facts of the matter before he acted. He was not a man who acted without facts. He had learned that the expensive way, in the early years of his dukedom, when quick judgments had cost him 2 good stewards, 1 friendship, and more than he liked to think about in ready money. He had become careful. He had become, some said, cold. He followed her to the edge of the wood. She stopped at the old beech tree that marked the boundary of Ashbourne land, the one with the hollow in its roots where generations of children had left acorns and wishes, and he stepped behind the wall of elder brush at the lane's edge and watched. She did not take anything from the fold of her arm. She did not look about with the calculation of a woman depositing stolen goods. She sat down on the exposed root of the beech tree, and she opened the thing she carried, and in the last flat light of the October dusk, he saw that it was a small leather-bound book, and she began to read. He did not move for a long time. The cold settled, and the light continued to die, and she read, her lips occasionally moving over a word in what he recognized, from the slight shape of them, as something requiring concentration. Not pleasure reading, something studied. Her finger traced along a line and stopped, and she mouthed the phrase again to herself. And the tip of her finger turned the page with a care that suggested she was handling something she had borrowed rather than owned. He recognized the care. He had seen it before, long ago, in the hands of a man who had been his father's under-librarian, a man of no means who had treated every volume in the Ashbourne collection as a personal trust. That man had eventually made something of himself. He was a barrister now, in Bristol, and he sent a letter at Christmas. The girl in the gray dress read for 20 minutes by his watch. Then she closed the book, tucked it back inside the fold of her arm, stood, smoothed her apron, and walked back toward the house. She passed within 15 feet of where he stood behind the elder brush, and he saw her face for the first time in good enough light to hold it. She was not what he had expected. She was not what his mother's language about the housemaids, incurious and categorical, the kind that classified rather than saw, had prepared him for. She was perhaps 23, with a quality of attention in her face that reminded him, absurdly, of scholars he had known at Oxford. Not beautiful in the season's vocabulary, not polished, not arranged for effect, but possessed of a kind of precision in her expression that he associated with people who had taught themselves to listen more than they spoke. She did not see him. She walked past and back through the gate, and the lane was empty. He stood in the dark for a moment longer than was necessary. He should have felt satisfied. No theft. No crisis. A maid had slipped away at dusk to read a borrowed book in the last light by a tree, and there was nothing there to investigate, and nothing there to do. He should have gone back inside and read the solicitor's letter and thought about nothing in particular. He thought about the shape of her mouth around a difficult phrase and the careful way her finger had turned the page, and he went inside and sat at his desk and did not read the letter at all. If you have ever watched a person do a small private thing that they believed no one could see, you will know something of what remained with the Duke of Ashbourne that evening. Leave your thoughts below on what you believe a woman hiding her learning might be carrying that is more precious than silver. Her name, as he discovered the next morning by the simple means of asking his housekeeper an apparently idle question, was Miss Vane. Cecily Vane. She was not strictly a housemaid, Mrs. Polwarth explained, her tone carefully neutral in the manner of a woman who had opinions she had decided not to voice. She was the daughter of the late Reverend Arthur Vane of Ashbourne Village, who had died the previous spring of a fever that had moved too quickly for the surgeon to do anything useful. The Reverend had left no savings to speak of, and a rectory that passed to his successor on the day of his burial, and his daughter had applied to the house for a position 3 weeks after the funeral. She had been given the duties of a parlor maid at the wage appropriate to a woman of that station, which was to say a wage that returned her nothing after her keep and left her exactly as dependent on the goodwill of the household as any other girl in grey wool. Mrs. Polwarth said all of this in the tone of someone reporting facts she found inadequate to the situation. There was a pause when she finished. The particular pause of a woman who had a good deal more to say and was exercising professional restraint. He thanked her and said nothing further, and went about his day. The day included his mother, which was its own education. The Dowager Duchess Agatha of Ashbourne was a woman who had arranged most of the important things in her life through the application of persistent social confidence, and she had arranged this particular visit because she had identified a candidate for her son's second marriage who she believed would suit everyone's interests, which meant primarily her own. The candidate was Miss Lavinia Croft of Croft Hall in Oxfordshire, 20 years of age and impeccably credentialed, who had arrived 3 days prior with a wardrobe that represented a serious investment in the project. "You were not at dinner again last night," his mother said, over breakfast, in the tone she used when making an accusation in the syntax of an observation. "I had letters," he said. "Lavinia plays very well," his mother said. "You will have noticed." "I heard her from the corridor," he said. "She is accomplished. She is accomplished in all the ways that matter," his mother said. "Her family is impeccable. Her portion is respectable, and she has the temperament for this house. She does not require amusement. She does not require explanation. She will manage exactly what needs managing, and ask nothing that is not owed." He said nothing. Outside the breakfast room windows, the Ashbourne Park lay still in the November gray, the deer moving in the middle distance with their unhurried, particular certainty. His mother set down her cup and looked at him with the expression she had refined over 30 years of managing the people she loved, which was the expression of a woman who has calculated the distance between the present situation and the desired outcome and found it bridgeable. You will not find another woman of her standing and her qualities who will accept you at your present humor, she said. You know that. He did know that, in the sense that he knew most things his mother said to him, which was that the fact itself was accurate, and the conclusion she drew from it was not his to accept. He was 34 years old and had been a widower for 3 years, and the first year of that widowhood had been, by general agreement, an experience that had left its mark on him. He had not returned to London. He had not attended a single ball or dinner of consequence. He had managed his estate and answered his correspondence and been, as the season put it with its characteristic precision, rather difficult. He was not, he thought, difficult. He was simply not willing to pretend. His mother had begun to find this inconvenient. He did not tell her about the girl reading by the beech tree. He did not, in fact, think about the girl by the beech tree during any of the hours that followed, or not in any way he would have named thinking. She was simply present at the edge of his attention in the way that a piece of music heard and half remembered makes itself felt at intervals throughout the day. He saw her again that afternoon in the corridor outside the portrait gallery. She was carrying a stack of linen, moving in the direction of the guest rooms, and she would have passed him without incident, except that a figure emerged from one of the doorways ahead of her, and the figure was his mother. And his mother stopped and looked at the girl in gray in the way she looked at furniture she was considering rearranging. "You," his mother said. "What is that on your apron?" The girl looked down. There was a small mark at the hem of her apron, the kind of mark a candle drip leaves, pale and faint. "Wax, your grace. I was attending to the candelabra in the blue sitting room." "It is slovenly," his mother said. "Common creature. This is not how the maids at Ashbourne present themselves." "I will change it directly," she said. "You will do your duties properly to begin with," his mother said, "and there will be no need to change anything. The maids at Ashbourne were not like this in my day. The common sort have no business in a house of this quality." He watched the girl receive this. She did not lower her eyes. She held his mother's gaze for precisely the right amount of time, which was long enough to register that she had heard, and not long enough to constitute a challenge. And then she said, "Yes, your grace," and continued down the corridor. His mother watched her go. Then she said to him, as if he had agreed with her by being present, "Half these girls have no business being in a house like this." He said nothing. His mother seemed to take his silence as agreement, and moved on toward the drawing room, and he stood for a moment in the corridor where the encounter had occurred, and thought about the quality of stillness the girl had maintained while being spoken to like furniture. There was something in that stillness that was not merely acceptance, it was a practiced discipline, the kind that is learned through long application, and it had cost her something to hold it. He could see the cost, if he looked carefully enough, in the line of her shoulders as she moved away. He thought about her name, Cecily Vane, the Reverend's daughter, a woman who had read Latin, and he was certain it had been Latin. The movement of her lips over the words had been the movement he remembered from his own schoolroom, the deliberate sounding of a language that did not yield to speed, by the light of an October dusk, sitting on the root of a beech tree, because there was no other time and no other place in her present life where such a thing was possible. He went back to his study and found among the books on his lower shelf a volume he had not opened in some years. It was a collection of agricultural essays in Latin, dull as standing water, the kind of thing that accumulated in country house libraries without being selected. He held it for a moment, and then he put it back. He was not, he told himself, going to do anything foolish. That evening, when he passed through the hall where the maids were finishing their work before the dinner bell, he paused near where she was polishing the brass fittings on the hall table, and he said, without looking at her directly, "There is a volume of Virgil's Georgics in the library, on the second shelf from the floor, north wall. It is unlikely to be wanted." He did not wait to see her reaction. He continued toward the dining room. At dinner, Lavinia Croft played the pianoforte, and his mother watched him with an expression of steady calculation. And Miss Croft's mother said several things about the winter season in London that he answered adequately, and the candles threw their warm, familiar light on the faces of people who had come to Ashbourne with a purpose he was not going to serve. And he thought about whether a woman in a borrowed room, at the end of a long day in which she had been called a common creature, would find time to go to the library. He did not know if she had gone. He told himself it was not his concern. He went to the library himself after the house had quieted, at 10:30, and the Virgil was where he had said it was, and it had not been moved. He sat in the leather chair near the fire and read 3 pages of it, and then set it down, because his attention was not on the page. He was there when the door opened at 11. She stopped in the doorway. He saw the exact moment she registered his presence and made the decision to stay or go, the calculation passing across her face in the space of a single breath. Then she said, "Your Grace, I did not know you were here. I will return another time." "No," he said. "Sit." She looked at the chair on the other side of the fire, which was a fine chair with embroidered cushions, and she did not sit in it. She stood near the window, her hands folded, at the correct distance of someone who was a member of his household and not his guest. He picked up the Virgil and held it out. She crossed the room and took it, and her fingers as they closed around the spine were careful in the way he had seen from a distance 3 nights ago. She looked at him, rather than at the book. She seemed to be waiting for something to resolve itself. "You are the Reverend's daughter," he said. "Yes." "He taught you?" She was quiet for a moment. "He taught me everything he knew. He was not always careful about distinguishing between what was appropriate for a girl to learn and what was not. There was something in this that wasn't quite an apology and not quite pride, an accurate inventory of a fact delivered without gloss. He was right not to be careful about it, he said. She looked at him then in a way that suggested she had not expected that sentence. It lasted only a moment, that look, and then she was composed again, the book held against her chest in the same posture he had seen by the beech tree, and she said, "I should not keep you, Your Grace." "You are not keeping me," he said. "I was not occupied." "Nonetheless," she said, and she dipped her head in a small formal acknowledgement and withdrew from the room. And the door closed behind her, and the fire settled, and he sat in the chair for a long time afterward with the impression of her still in the room. 3 days later, his mother came to him with an announcement. It was not a request. His mother had not made a request in the ordinary sense in a very long time. She said, with the quality of finality she reserved for things she had already decided, that she had spoken to the Croft family, and that the matter was well along toward a conclusion, and that she expected him to call on Lavinia formally the following morning, and to conduct himself in the way appropriate to a gentleman making his intentions known. He said that he had not made any intentions known, because he had formed none. His mother said that this was precisely the difficulty, and that it was time for the difficulty to end. He said that he would think about it. His mother said, "There is nothing to think about. You are 34 years old, Ashbourne. You are not a young man who may permit himself the luxury of sentiment. The estate requires a mistress and an heir, and a future, and Lavinia Croft is a sensible girl who will provide all 3 without complaint. She is not common. She is not a creature who should be working in a house such as this for wages. What more do you want?" He did not answer that question, because the answer that came to him was not one he was prepared to say aloud in his mother's sitting room on a November morning. The answer was that he wanted to know what passage Cecily Vane had been reading that evening, alone by the beech tree, in the dying light, when she thought no one in the world could see her. 2 days after that conversation, his mother's patience completed its arc. He learned what she had done from Mrs. Polwarth, who came to his study at 4 in the afternoon with the expression of a woman delivering news she found professionally distasteful. She had been instructed, the housekeeper said, by the Dowager Duchess to release Miss Vane from her position without a character. The offense cited was impudence. The effective date was that same evening. He was very still for a moment. "On whose authority?" he said. Mrs. Polwarth said quietly, "The Dowager Duchess suggested the instruction came from you, Your Grace." He stood up. "It did not," he said. Mrs. Polwarth said nothing. She was a woman who had served Ashbourne for 19 years and understood the architecture of the household better than any other person in it. And her silence had the quality of someone who had already drawn her own conclusions and found them confirmed. "Where is Miss Vane?" he said. "In the servants' hall, Your Grace. She has been told to be out by 7. He went downstairs. The servants' hall went very quiet when he entered. There were 4 maids at the long table and the butler at the far end sorting correspondence, and they all became still in the particular way of people who understand that something is happening that is above their station to witness. He looked until he found her. She was seated at the near end of the table, her hands folded on the surface in front of her, her traveling bundle on the floor at her feet. She was not crying. She looked at him with an expression that was careful and contained, and that told him nothing about what it had cost her to put it together. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had been looking at her for several weeks without understanding that she was the most self-possessed person in his household and possibly in his county, and that the self-possession had nothing to do with rank or training, but with an interior life that had been built carefully in the only space available to it. "Miss Vane," he said, "come with me." She rose and followed him, and he was aware of every eye in the room tracking their exit. And he was aware that this was the moment after which nothing could be said to be the same as it had been. And he found that he was not troubled by that awareness. He took her to the library. She stood near the window in the same posture she had taken 3 nights ago, hands folded, at the correct distance of someone who was waiting to learn what kind of thing this was. He noticed that she had already changed out of the gray wool dress into the plainer garments she must have arrived in, and that the traveling bundle was a small one, and that she had arranged the small bundle with a neatness that suggested she had had practice packing what was essential into very little space. "My mother does not have the authority to dismiss my staff," he said. "I see," she said. "She told Mrs. Polwarth that the instruction came from me." "I suspected it had not," she said. He looked at her. "How?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the night you showed me where the Virgil was, Your Grace. You said that a father was right not to be careful about what a girl could learn. Men who believe that do not generally concern themselves about a maid's impudence. He was not accustomed to having his reasoning reconstructed by the people he was speaking to. It was not an unpleasant experience. 'You will stay,' he said. 'I will speak to my mother. I would prefer not to be the subject of a difficulty between you and the Dowager Duchess,' she said. 'You are not the subject,' he said. 'The subject is whether my mother may issue instructions in my name. That is a different matter entirely, and one I have been intending to address for some time.' She looked at him for a moment with that quality of attention he had observed from a distance on the night he had followed her to the beech tree. She looked as if she were reading him the way she read the Latin, carefully, turning a phrase back to be sure of it, before proceeding to the next. "I will stay," she said, "if it will not cause you trouble you would not otherwise have." "It will cause me trouble I intend to have," he said. The conversation with his mother was neither long nor comfortable. He was direct with her in a manner he had been deferring for the better part of 2 weeks, and she was equally direct in return, and the substance of what passed between them was that she had made a decision about his life that she had no right to make, and that she had done so by misrepresenting his authority, and that this would not happen again. His mother said, among other things, that he was being ridiculous. She said he was throwing away his future for the sake of a common creature who had no business in any room of Ashbourne that was not a servant's room. She said she had said this before and been ignored, and she was saying it now for the last time. He said that he was being precise. She said that he was throwing away his future for the sake of a sentiment he had not even examined. He said that he was not throwing anything away. He was declining to pick up something that had never been his to begin with. She left 3 days later, with Lavinia Croft and her mother and the entirety of their collective wardrobe, and the house went quiet in the way a house does when the people who have been filling its rooms with purpose are gone. It was a particular quiet. Not empty. Clarified. The day after his mother left, he went to the library in the afternoon. She was there. She had permission now, Mrs. Polwarth having communicated the household's new understanding of the matter, and she sat in the chair on the other side of the fire. Not the embroidered chair she had declined the first evening, but the plain wooden chair near the window that caught the last of the afternoon light, and she was reading the Virgil. She looked up when he came in, and did not close the book. "Your Grace," she said. "What passage?" he said. She looked at him. "The night by the beech tree," he said. "I want to know what you were reading." A pause. She said, "The second Georgic. The one about the vine dressers." "Why that one?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My father had a note in the margin of his copy, in his own hand, at the passage about the man who asks nothing from the world but the ground he works. He wrote, in the margin, 'This is not defeat.' I was trying to remember whether I had understood him correctly." She paused again. "It was his copy I borrowed. It is the only thing of his I have that is worth carrying." He stood in the doorway of the library without speaking for a long moment. He had believed, after his wife died, that he had learned the particular shape of grief, that he knew its proportions and its texture, and the places where it pressed hardest. He had believed this in the way a man believes he understands the ocean, because he has been near it several times. He understood now that he had been standing on the shore. What the girl in the gray dress was carrying, the thing he had followed her through the October dusk to discover, was a father's handwriting. A father's voice preserved in a margin note, carried in a borrowed book, read in the dying light by a beech tree, because there was no other time and no other place in the whole of her reduced life where she could be alone with it. He crossed the room and sat down in the plain wooden chair beside her, not the leather chair by the fire, and the fire sent its warmth across them both. And the afternoon light came through the window, at the angle it came through in November. That specific British light that is gold and gray at once. "Read it to me," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she opened the book and found the passage, and she read it aloud to him in Latin, her voice low and careful. And when she came to her father's note, she paused and translated it for him, word by word, as if he could not have managed it himself. But he did not correct her, because she was not translating for his benefit. After she finished, the fire said what fires say, and outside the window the bare branches of the oak moved in the November wind. "Tell me about him," he said. She looked at the page rather than at him. He was a man who understood Greek, but was better in Latin. He had a way of beginning sermons that alarmed his congregation because they could not tell where he was going until the third paragraph. And then it was always obvious. He planted lettuces every spring, and they never came up, and he planted them again the next year. He taught me the conditional perfect tense on a Tuesday and the indicative perfect on a Wednesday, and did not explain the difference until I asked him. And when I asked him, he said, "That is the correct order," and I still do not know whether he meant the grammar or the habit of living. He listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, "My wife's name was Eleanor. She died of a fever, as your father did. She was 28 years old. She had been afraid of horses her entire life, and she had never told me, because she believed it was a deficiency, and I was a man who kept horses, and I did not find this out until she was gone, and someone mentioned it, someone who had known her before I did. And I thought about how many times I had suggested we ride out together, and how she had always found a reason to prefer walking. And I did not know whether to be grateful that she had loved me enough to conceal it, or devastated that she had thought concealment was required." Cecily Vane did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Both, I think. At the same time." "Yes," he said. He had not said that to anyone. He had been carrying the specific weight of it for 3 years, the particular grief of the thing he had not known in time to change, and he had said it now in one breath to a woman he had followed through his own garden in the dark, because he had been certain she was taking something that did not belong to her. She had been taking nothing. She had been carrying everything. The fire settled. A log shifted and sent a cascade of sparks up the chimney and subsided into steady warmth. He said, "You have been a member of this household for 6 weeks, and I have offered you nothing but a single suggestion about a book on a shelf, and you have been dismissed without cause and reinstated without ceremony, and I have followed you through my own garden, like a man who did not trust what his own eyes were telling him." She did not look away from the fire. "I am not a man who speaks before he is certain," he said. "I have been certain for some time." She said very quietly, "Your Grace." "My name is James," he said. "You may use it or not as you choose." A long pause. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare oaks, and the fire was warm, and the afternoon light was almost gone. "James," she said. It was barely more than a breath. A single syllable that crossed the distance between correct address and something else entirely. And he felt it in the way the body registers things the mind has not yet agreed to name. He said nothing for a moment, because nothing was required. What was required had been said, and the rest would follow from it, in time. In the way things follow when two people have stopped pretending they do not see each other. He reached across and turned the page of the Virgil, carefully, in the way she had turned it by the beech tree. And his hand was close enough to hers that the air between them carried warmth. They stayed in the library until the candles needed lighting. There is a particular quality to a Regency drawing room on a December evening when the fire has been built up against the cold and the candles are fresh, and there are only 2 people in the room who are choosing, with full deliberation, to be exactly where they are. If this story has moved you at all, stay with us a little longer. The formal matter of it was handled the following week, with a visit from the family solicitor, Mr. Dawes, whose opinion of the proceedings he did not volunteer, and whose competence in recording the relevant details was impeccable. The solicitor arrived on a Tuesday morning, produced documents of the appropriate gravity, and departed by afternoon with everything in the correct order. He was a small, precise man who had served the Ashbourne family for 11 years, and he handed the pen to Cecily Vane across the library desk with the quiet ceremony of someone who understood that he was witnessing something that would matter, and she signed her name with the same unhurried care with which she turned a page. The engagement was noted in the register at the Ashbourne Village Church, and the vicar, who had known Cecily Vane since she was a girl, sitting in the front pew watching her father deliver sermons that confused his congregation before they illuminated them, said nothing more than what was required of him, and shook her hand with a warmth that was not professional. His mother sent a letter from London. He read it and put it aside. The letter from his mother contained, among other things, the suggestion that he had been manipulated by a clever girl who had correctly identified a lonely man, and that the season would find his decision inexplicable, and that the Croft family would not forgive the slight. He wrote back a single paragraph informing her that he had not asked the season's opinion and that the Croft family was owed no particular apology for the failure of an arrangement that had never formally existed. He did not show Cecily the letter. He did not need to. She knew in the way she knew most things, without his having to explain it. She had moved into the east sitting room, which had better morning light than the parlor-maid's quarters and which had access, through a connecting door, to the small study where she had begun to keep the books that were accumulating around her at a rate that suggested the Ashbourne library was not going to be sufficient for very long. Mrs. Polwarth had rearranged the household with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting to do so, and had said to Cecily, simply and without ceremony, that she was glad the business was settled, and that was the entirety of what the household required by way of announcement. The village was another matter, but the village had known Cecily Vane since her childhood, and its gossip, when it ran its course, was not unkind. She was the Reverend's daughter. She was educated beyond what most people thought advisable and capable, beyond what most people thought comfortable, and the Duke of Ashbourne was a man who had been alone in his house for 3 years, growing careful and careful and careful, until the care had become something very close to armor. And here was a woman who had not required him to remove the armor, but who had simply looked at him through it, clearly and without either pity or performance, and called what she saw by its right name. The village understood, eventually, that this was not a peculiar match. It was a precise one. He found the copy of the Virgil on his desk one morning in late November, with a piece of paper folded between its pages. The paper had been placed at the second Georgic. When he unfolded it, he found a note in her handwriting, which was the handwriting of a woman who had been taught by a man who believed in forming each letter as if it mattered. And the note said, "I looked again at the passage. I think he meant both." He kept the note in his breast pocket for 3 weeks. He was aware that this was an indulgent thing to do, and he did it anyway. In the evenings, when the house had settled and the candles were lit against the early dark of December, he found himself listening for the sound of her in the rooms adjacent to the library. The soft close of a door. The particular sound of a chair drawn across stone. The near silence of a person engaged in the company of a book. He had lived in this house for the whole of his adult life, and known its sounds by memory. And this new sound, the sound of another person present and unhurried, and making no demands on the quiet, was the most companionable thing he had experienced in 3 years. She did not fill the silence with speech. She did not perform ease or contentment for his benefit. She was simply present, which was a quality he had not understood he valued until he had lived without it for long enough to know the exact shape of its absence. One evening she looked up from across the room and said, "Did you know that the vine passages in the second Georgic are almost certainly wrong? The planting instructions. My father argued they were transcription errors." He considered this. What was his evidence? "Columella," she said. He made notes in the back of his Virgil, cross-referencing the two. "I have not been able to find a copy of Columella in your library." He said, "I will write to London." She looked at him for a moment, and the firelight caught her expression, which was the expression of a woman who was still in the early practice of believing that things might be given to her simply because she needed them. "You do not have to," she said. "I know," he said. She returned to her book. He returned to his. The fire said what fires say in December, which is that warmth is not contingent on deserving, and outside the windows of Ashbourne the first snow of the season had begun to fall. The wedding was in December, at the Ashbourne village church, on a morning when the frost was still on the grass, and the light came through the old clear glass of the windows in that particular winter way, flat and clean and cold at the edges, warm at the center. The vicar was brief. There were perhaps 30 people present. None of them were from the season. Most of them were from the village, and several of them had known the Reverend Arthur Vane. And a few of them were quietly crying in the way that people cry when they recognize that something just has been done. He put the ring on her hand, and she looked at him in the way she had looked at him from the moment he had said, in the library, that he intended to have the trouble. Directly. Without deflection. With the full, steady weight of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be seen, she was going to let herself be seen. After, in the drawing room of Ashbourne, with a small fire and a light supper and Mrs. Polwarth presiding over the proceedings with a gravity entirely appropriate to the occasion, she sat beside him, and she said quietly, "You know you could have simply asked me about the book." "I know," he said. "At any point," she said. "From the beginning." "I know," he said again. She looked at the fire. "You followed me through your own garden in the dark." "I did." "Because you thought I was a thief." "I thought," he said carefully, "that something was being taken. I was not wrong about that." She looked at him. He looked at the fire. After a moment she made a sound that was, in the vocabulary of the Regency, as close to a laugh as a woman of her particular composure was going to permit herself in public, even if the public in question consisted only of one husband and one discreet housekeeper at the far end of the room. Later, when the supper things had been cleared and Mrs. Polwarth had withdrawn, she took the Virgil from the mantelpiece where she had placed it that morning, her father's copy with its careful marginal notes, and she set it on her lap, and she opened it to the second Georgic. "Read the passage for me," he said. "The one with the note." She read it, first in Latin and then in English, slowly, the way her father had taught her, giving each phrase its full weight before moving to the next. The fire was warm. The snow fell beyond the window, light and steady, making no sound at all on the glass. When she came to the marginal note, she read that too, her father's margin note, the 4 words he had written in his careful hand. "This is not defeat." She closed the book. Her hand rested on the cover in the same careful posture he had first seen from behind the elder brush in the October lane, from a distance of 15 feet, in the last gray light of a dusk when he had been a man who believed he was looking at a thief and could not yet understand what he was actually seeing. He reached across and placed his hand over hers, and the fire was warm, and the snow continued to fall outside the windows of Ashbourne, quiet and accumulating, entirely certain of itself. He was not a man who had believed, 3 years into his careful solitude, that he was waiting for anyone. He understood now that he had been wrong about that, and that being wrong about it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. If Cecily's journey moved you, leave a word in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end.